Hello and welcome to Hastings County. I'm glad that you could join us again here today for another TTRPG talk. This series discusses tabletop role-playing games, related materials, world-building suggestions, and game design. Today we'll be discussing a game that is actively kickstarting, but please note that this video is not sponsored. I have not received a free copy of the game, any form of compensation, or a promise of future compensation, monetary or otherwise. All views related to this game are my own, and all information that I have related to the game, and therefore are sharing, are based on the Kickstarter page and a related press kit. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Recently, I got a request to cover a Kickstarter called Deployment, the World War II TTRPG. In this game, the player characters are soldiers that have been drafted into one of the armies of World War II. While there are elements of campaign strategy and obviously combat, one of the key focuses of the game is actually to emulate the terrors of combat, the suspenseful boredom and camaraderie that can develop in the periods in between, and the fragility of human life throughout it all. Not only does this seek to expand the basics of war-focused TTRPGs through mechanics built around simulating morale and, of course, quality of life, but also relationship building and rewarding you for just as much for helping your fellow soldiers as it would be for defeating the opposition. While I have not had a chance to read through a full copy of the deployment game, its attempt at capturing the realities of war reminded me actually a lot of Mashed, the Korean War RPG set in a mobile army surgical hospital that you can see here. And this is based on the same memoirs and experiences that inspired the legendary MASH franchise on TV and movies of the 70s and early 80s. This game also seeks to capture the horrors of war, the struggle of survival against the odds, and building relationships in the face of that horror. It also tries to show how people respond to the stresses of loss and constantly be under threat, both socially and psychologically. These two games are not exactly your everyday TTRPG fare because they deal with topics that are potentially deeply disturbing or harmful to your players. They're not obviously they're not family friendly, and they certainly contain a lot of issues that many people might be uncomfortable with. Mashed explicitly warns players about the risks of games centered around organized violence, deprivation, and medical treatment. And of course, it also mentions the fact that, when people are under high amounts of stress, they have a tendency to resort to things that are potentially damaging to their physical and mental health, whether that be alcohol, drugs, sex, or other risk-taking behaviors. The manual, however, also examines the implications of playing a historical game that, for example, whether or not to simulate discrimination based on race, nationality, gender identity, or sexual orientation, as would have existed in the 1950s U.S. Army, again, while deployed in Korea. While I do not know if Deployment's core rulebook addresses these issues in a similar way, it definitely explicitly contains a number of safety tools, as outlined in its table of contents, which you can see on the a bit further down on the in the page here. There's a good chunk of potential safety tools right here. The question, though, is why do we need safety tools? For a game like Deployment or Mashed, concern about our fellow players, as I mentioned, would be a very important thing that many players and game masters would probably think about. Many might do so out of concern for the maturity of the topics, especially if younger players are involved, or upsetting others due to topics that might come up at the table, again, like deprivation for soldiers and civilians alike, physical and potentially even sexual violence, the graphic injury or death of major players, or major player characters, or just major characters in general, mass casualties, injury, death, all of that stuff. While it is certainly true that in games like these, concerns honestly should be higher than normal, this does not mean that we should not care about safety or utilize safety tools, or just checking in with people whenever we're having a more family-friendly or mainstream RPG experience. First, many RPGs have mechanics that, of course, enshrine in them topics that can lead to discomfort or real-life social conflict at the table. For example, many games have acts of violence built into their mechanics, even in games where violence is not necessarily the core of the game engine. Others might have bioessentialism or racism baked into their mechanics or their lore. Secondly, many people have been through traumas in their life that can be easily recalled based on certain triggers. They may have phobias or intense fears, or simply find certain topics very uncomfortable. So, for example, I myself have a trauma related to April 1st or April Fool's Day, which I would very much rather not have anything related to that in my life ever again. However, there is a third item that we need to be concerned about, and that is actually my main concern in this video, that being bleed. I know there's a good chance that many of you who have been long involved with TTRPGs may be aware of what bleed is, but I want to go over exactly what I mean, both for those of you who might be unfamiliar with this concept, and also to make sure that those of you who have heard of bleed before, that we're all sort of operating on the same definition, at least for the sake of this video. Much of fiction relies on being able to engage with the work and characters in that fiction, in that piece of media, on an emotional level. This could be a sense of schadenfreude, especially in the case of antagonists or like anti-heroes, but more often there's at least one character that the creators of the media intended us, the audience, to connect with or to feel things alongside of, reveling in their triumphs, sympathizing with their sorrow and their pain, and so on. When that fiction becomes more interactive and involves more investment in specific characters, like some types of computer games, but I'm mainly, of course, discussing role-playing or acting, this can increasingly blur the emotional lines between you and your character, especially if the point of the game is for you to portray a character. This can make the character's emotions that they would be feeling if they were, a real person, personal to you. And bleed can make it also difficult for you to keep your own emotions both from inside, both about what's happening in the game and stuff happening outside the game, influencing the way that you have your character act. So this could be bleed in and bleed out is often the term used to refer to this. It is important, I'm going to go ahead and note now, it is important that this is not the same thing as, for example, a little kid who might confuse fact or fiction, or coming to confuse your own identity with that of your character to the point where you're sort of losing a connection with your sense of self. This is also not attempting to describe the symptoms of depersonalization, derealization, or disassociation. These are all kind of part of the fear that was behind that sort of satanic panic and, theories involving video games triggering violent action in kids, and other strange phenomenons that people kind of assume might happen, like, the level of bleed that we see in like the Assassin's Creed series because of people using the Animus and stuff like that. That is completely outside of the realm of what we're talking about. Depending upon where we draw the line between being empathetic with your character and bleed can be useful and in some cases necessary for the function of certain types of games. Some games are designed with the intention of triggering certain emotions in the player in order to help them empathize with a certain group they would otherwise have a harder time understanding the experiences of. Sometimes these emotions are just like secondary emotions. Basically, you're feeling something because of something happening to your character. Or they could be primary emotions where like the character is experiencing certain negative things, and then that bleed through makes you feel sympathetic or empathetic toward the character. For example, There are plenty of informal hacks out there to games like Monopoly or Life that were designed specifically with the intention of simulating systemic, basically discrimination or disadvantages that many people experience in, for example, the United States economy. Dog Eat Dog, which is an RPG by Liam Lewangag Burke, plays out the social and political effects of colonialism with a focus on the experience of Pacific Islanders. Other games like Adam Bell's My Brain is a Stick of Butter is designed to try to show players what it's like to live with ADHD, with the mechanics intentionally creating frustration, especially for some players who haven't necessarily experienced ADHD themselves, as they grapple with the simulated symptoms of the game. A number of genre games, of course, also require a certain level of empathy or bleed in order to actually be effective as a game. It is really hard for horror games, for example, to be effective if they do not create a certain level of tension, fear, or dread in the character, usually because they're in the player, usually because their character would be experiencing those emotions. War games, again, like we discussed with Deployment and Mashed, focus on tension, dread, loss, hopelessness, stress, in order to express the horrors of living through, war. Specific campaign types, like, for example, if you build up something based on the child motif, which, most recently was demonstrated through the Mandalorian TV show, require an emotional connection between the child and the group of Guardian player characters in order to work most effectively, which, again, that would normally be built through bleed, either because the story is attaching you as a player, and therefore your character is more likely to potentially start acting against their usual character type, or you know full well that your character would become emotionally attached to this being, and therefore that attachment is influencing your decisions as a player, and sometimes obviously your emotion, as we described with Bleed. However, there are some games out there that either in their text or in the subtext or just in the community that has been built around that game that encourage players to lean even more heavily into Bleed. So, for example, the most recent source book for Vampire the Masquerade that will be released by Renegade Games Studios, called Bloodstained Love, has a section in it that's recently been shared on social media that explicitly discusses and describes bleed hunting. This is a term that comes from the LARP community, especially Nordic LARP, with the idea that you should be actively seeking out bleed in order to more strongly feel the sorts of emotions that your character would be feeling in order to make your own portrayal of your character more realistic. While the promotional materials on Renegade Game Studios' website related to Bloodstained Love do claim, and I quote, advice that they will contain advice and tools for safety and collaboration, expanding on the core book's advice for considerate play appendix. So while that is the case, the romantic subject of the source book, which you can probably guess from the title, Bloodstained Love, seems to me like the authors are playing with fire a bit here in encouraging this type of strongly leading into the bleed behavior. This type of bleed hunting behavior can be harmful without special care being taken. A player who experiences intense and regular bleed, like you might expect for a game like that, can start transferring those emotions into their out-of-game life. Strong out-of-game emotions can also derail intentions for roleplay in-game as well. Most often, I personally have seen this with romantic relationships that don't match up between people either in-game and out-of-game. Either because, of course, you have people in a relationship out-of-game who might have characters with in-game who in-game are not in a relationship or have an antagonistic relationship or are in relationships with other player characters or NPCs. Or we might have the flip side where you have two individuals who their characters are in an in-game relationship, but they don't have a romantic relationship out of game, and that makes things really weird sometimes. I, however, have also seen in-game rivalries spiral out of control, and um, influence things out of game. I've seen, and I have also seen in-game political machinations literally lead to crimes being committed. Safety tools can catch these situations early enough to hopefully keep them from becoming a problem. That's one of the whole points why they exist. Even if we're not playing a game with intense emotions involved, like, let's say, Vampire the Masquerade, or Deployment, or Mashed, or any number of others, it is important to be incredibly observant, to check in with your fellow players, and to be open about how you feel and when you're experiencing bleed. You might find that you're not the only one at the table, or you might find that maybe a certain genre is not really a good fit for you, and that's fine, right? I've personally come to accept that horror, whether they be movies or games, is not that great of a good fit for me, either because I just have a hard time attaching or associating with the sort of the fear that you would really need in order to get a good experience out of a horror game. I'm okay with playing them. They're just not my jam, and that's fine. And that might be this case for you. Or you might find that, certain bleed causes or triggers certain memories or emotions that you just don't really want to have to deal with, either because you're still healing from that, or because it's not something you feel is an appropriate thing to have to go through, especially with, especially when you're dealing with a group of strangers or people you don't know very well. If you'd like to definitely look into more when it comes to bleed and stuff like that, there's lots of articles out there discussing emotional bleed. Also, procedural bleed or memnotic bleed. Emotional, of course, being what we were primarily focusing on here. Procedural being like, just especially LARPing, certain physical actions and things that you normally wouldn't do that are part of your character kind of end up kind of bleeding into your personal actions as a person. So, for example, if you RP like a military character a lot, some of that mannerism, the way you hold yourself and stuff, might end up sort of entering into your personal behaviors, even if you don't necessarily intend them to. One thing I would also recommend that you definitely take a look at would be GMS's magazine's a video that they just recently released, just particularly discussing bleed and the controversy kind of surrounding this bloodstained love, and sort of the social media response, some of the social media response to that, just basically, in super opposition to the concept of bleed or encouraging bleed. In this video, they definitely take a more sort of nuanced approach, which is kind of what I've attempted to do in my video as well, where yes, bleed, or at least, empathetic relationship and attachment is kind of necessary for certain types of role play, but there's definitely taking it too far. Just thank you very much to Luna of Muddied Watered Games for, of course, asking me to discuss and talk about Deployment, the World War II TTRPG, even if this probably went in a very different direction than what they had likely intended. A link to the Kickstarter can be found in the description down below, which is running until December 7th of 2023. As you can see, they are more than halfway to their goal. This is as of November 11th. So go ahead and check out their page to see if this might be of interest to you. One thing I do want to note is that when it comes to the different sorts of packages you can sign up for, you can just get the game. You can get the game with a GM sort of screen, both physical and digital. I think there's like a sort of a premium version of the physical that will eventually be created that probably won't necessarily have a cover that looks like that, but it'll probably look different. It hasn't actually been designed yet, because one of the reasons why they're raising money is the game's already done. They're more raising money for like art and stuff. At least that's the impression that I got. And there is a campaign, which I believe is built around defending against Barbarossa, which, as it mentions there in that little blurb, is more than 30 sessions long. So that's quite interesting as well. Yeah, so check it out. The link, of course, will be found in the description down below, along with the video that I had previously just mentioned, and also mashed. So don't forget to like your itch purchases and have a good zone. I have not received a freak. So frustrating. Or racism baked into their mechanics or their lore, some of them being because they're just older games, and of course carry a lot of that baggage with them. Some of them just because they were honestly made by douchebags. I shouldn't say that, but it's true.
If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.